It is September 14th, 1944, and the ground trembles beneath 8-year-old Greta's feet. She stands in the doorway of a farmhouse somewhere on the Lithuanian border, watching smoke rise from the horizon where East Prussia burns. Her fingernails are caked with dirt. Her dress, once pale blue, is now the color of ash. She does not speak. She cannot remember the last time she ate. Behind her, voices murmur in a language she does not yet understand. Lithuanian words that will soon replace everything she knows. A woman with rough, calloused hands reaches down and touches Greta's hair, then quickly pulls away, glancing toward the road where Soviet patrols pass daily. In that moment, Greta does not yet know that her name will be taken from her. She does not know that by winter, she will answer only to Grażyna, and that speaking her real name aloud could mean death, not just for her, but for everyone who dares to shelter her. If stories like this move you as deeply as they move me, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. These forgotten stories deserve to live again, and your voice helps make that happen. Greta was born in 1936 in Königsberg, East Prussia, in a modest apartment near the Pregel River, where her father worked as a dockhand and her mother mended clothes for military officers' wives. She had an older brother named Hans, who taught her to count using pebbles collected from the riverbank. On Sundays, they walked to the bakery where the owner, Herr Müller, would slip them day-old bread with a wink. Greta's world was small but warm. The smell of her mother's potato soup, the sound of her father's deep laugh, the weight of her brother's hand holding hers as they crossed the cobblestone streets. She dreamed of nothing more than growing up to be a teacher, standing in front of a classroom with chalk dust on her fingers. In the winter of 1943, she turned 7 and received a porcelain doll with painted eyes. She named it Liesel. She carried it everywhere, whispering secrets into its unchanging face. That doll would be the last piece of her childhood she would carry into the chaos. The war had always been distant, something the adults whispered about after she went to bed, something that made her father's face grow hard when he read the newspaper. But by the summer of 1944, the war was no longer far away. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, and the German army was collapsing. Evacuation orders came in frantic waves. Greta's father had already been conscripted months earlier. They did not know if he was alive. Her mother packed what little they had, clothes, a loaf of bread, photographs, and they joined the flood of refugees fleeing westward. The roads were clogged with carts, families, wounded soldiers, and fear. Greta remembers the sound of airplanes overhead, the way her mother would pull her into a ditch and cover her body with her own. She remembers the cold, the hunger that became a constant ache, and the silence that fell over the columns of refugees when artillery fire echoed in the distance. Then, one night in early September, her mother shook her awake. "We have to run," she whispered. "Do not make a sound." They ran through the forest, but somewhere in the darkness Greta lost her mother's hand. She called out, once, twice, but there was no answer, only the snap of branches and the distant rumble of tanks. When dawn came, Greta was alone. She wandered for days, maybe weeks. Time lost meaning. She survived by eating berries, drinking from streams and hiding when she heard voices. Her dress tore on brambles. Her shoes fell apart. The porcelain doll slipped from her hands one night and shattered on a stone. She did not cry. She had no tears left. Other children appeared in the woods, thin, silent shadows like herself. They moved in small packs, scavenging, stealing, begging. They were called Wolfskinder, wolf children, because they prowled the forests and villages like wild animals, desperate and alone. Some were as young as 3. Some had forgotten their own names. Greta joined them, but she did not speak. She had learned that silence kept you safe. The group drifted eastward toward Lithuania, where rumors whispered of Lithuanian farmers who might share a scrap of bread, who might not turn them away. The Russian-controlled zones were deadly. Soviet authorities had orders to remove all fascist children, to send them to state orphanages or labor camps where they would disappear. But in Lithuania, there was a chance, a slim, dangerous chance. It was mid-September, when Greta found herself standing at the edge of a farm outside a village whose name she would never learn. An older woman emerged from the house, her face lined and weary. She stared at Greta for a long moment, then glanced nervously toward the road. Soviet patrols passed through daily. Harboring a German child was not just forbidden, it was an act of treason. Families caught sheltering Vokietukai, the little Germans, faced deportation to Siberia, imprisonment or execution. Yet the woman stepped forward and beckoned Greta inside. The farmhouse was dim and smelled of hay and smoke. There were other children there, Lithuanian children, thin and watchful, and an old man who sat by the fire and said nothing. The woman gave Greta a bowl of watery soup and a piece of black bread. Greta ate in silence, her hands trembling. Then the woman knelt down and looked into Greta's eyes. She spoke in Lithuanian, words Greta did not understand, but the meaning was clear. "You are not Greta anymore." The woman brought out a needle and thread and began altering a dress that had belonged to her own daughter. She gestured for Greta to remove her torn German clothes, and when Greta hesitated, the woman's expression hardened. There was no room for sentiment. Survival demanded erasure. Over the following days, the woman taught Greta a new name, Grażyna. She repeated it again and again until Greta could say it without faltering. She taught her Lithuanian phrases, "Aš esu Grażyna," "Aš esu Lietuve." "I am Grażyna. I am Lithuanian." She forbade Greta from speaking German, even in whispers, even in sleep. The old man watched from the corner, his eyes full of sorrow and fear. The woman explained, through gestures and broken fragments of German, that if anyone discovered the truth, the entire family would be destroyed. Greta understood. She nodded. She swallowed her past and became Grażyna. The transformation was not just linguistic, it was existential. Greta's identity was systematically dismantled. Her memories of Königsberg, of her mother and brother, of Herr Müller and the porcelain doll, all of it had to be buried. She learned to move like a Lithuanian child, to lower her eyes when Soviet soldiers passed, to recite the Lord's Prayer in Lithuanian, even though she barely understood the words. The woman, whom Greta now called Močiutė, grandmother, burned Greta's German clothes in the stove. She told neighbors that Grażyna was a distant cousin, whose parents had died in the deportations, a plausible story in a land where death and displacement were routine. Soviet records were chaotic. Birth certificates were lost in the war's chaos, and it was possible, just barely possible, to forge a new identity for a child. Močiutė brought Greta to the local Soviet administrative office and presented forged documents claiming that Grażyna had been born in a nearby village. The official barely glanced at the papers. He stamped them. Greta, Grażyna, was now officially Lithuanian. At night, Greta lay on a straw mattress in the corner of the farmhouse and stared at the ceiling. She wanted to cry, but the tears would not come. She wanted to remember her mother's face, but the image was already fading. She whispered her real name under her breath, "Greta, Greta, Greta." But even that felt foreign now, like a word from another lifetime. Močiutė would shake her awake if she heard German sounds in her sleep. "You must forget," she would hiss. "Forget, or we all die." And so Greta tried to forget. She tried to become Grażyna, but forgetting is not the same as erasing. The memories lingered like ghosts, fleeting, painful, impossible to grasp. The historical context of Greta's erasure is rooted in the catastrophic collapse of East Prussia at the end of World War II. Between January and April 1945, as Soviet forces advanced, an estimated 2 million German civilians fled westward in what became one of the largest forced migrations in history. Thousands of children were separated from their families during chaotic evacuations, bombings, and mass violence. Many died of starvation, exposure, or disease. Those who survived became known as Wolfskinder, wolf children, orphaned, displaced, and left to fend for themselves in the forests and villages of East Prussia and Lithuania. Historians estimate that between 5,000 and 25,000 of these children made it to Lithuania, where they faced a brutal choice: risk Soviet detention and deportation to state orphanages or labor camps, or seek shelter with Lithuanian families who were themselves living under Soviet occupation and terror. Lithuanians who took in German children risked severe punishment, deportation to Siberia, imprisonment, or execution, yet many did. They hid the children, gave them new names, forged documents, and taught them to speak Lithuanian. It was an act of extraordinary compassion in a time of unimaginable cruelty. By October 1944, Greta, now Grażyna, had learned enough Lithuanian to pass as a local child, though her accent remained imperfect and her understanding shallow. She worked on the farm, feeding chickens, hauling water, and helping Močiutė prepare meals. She avoided the village center where Soviet soldiers drank and laughed and sometimes grabbed young women. She learned to recognize the sound of military trucks and to hide when they approached. One afternoon, a Soviet officer came to the farm, asking questions about displaced children. Močiutė stood in the doorway, her face calm, and gestured toward Grażyna. "My cousin's child," she said in Lithuanian. "Her parents were deported last year. The officer looked at Grażyna, who stood frozen, her heart pounding. He asked her name. "Grażyna," she whispered. He asked where she was born. She recited the name of the village Mochiute had taught her. He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded and walked away. Greta did not breathe until he was gone. That night, Mochiute held her and wept. "You did well," she said. "You are Grażyna now." But the fear never left. Every knock on the door, every passing patrol, every stranger's glance carried the threat of exposure. Other wolf children were not so fortunate. Greta heard whispers of children dragged from farms and sent to Soviet orphanages, where they were beaten for speaking German, where they were told they had no past, no family, no identity. Some were adopted by Soviet families and disappeared entirely. Others were simply registered as Soviet citizens and sent to work in factories or on collective farms. The Soviet state sought to erase all traces of German influence, and children were the easiest targets. They were malleable, vulnerable, and expendable. To the Soviet authorities, a German child was not a victim. They were the offspring of fascists, inherently guilty, inherently disposable. The war ended in May 1945, but for Greta, the war never truly ended. The Soviet occupation of Lithuania deepened, and the terror intensified. Mass deportations resumed, targeting Lithuanian nationalists, resistors, and anyone deemed a threat to Soviet authority. Between 1945 and 1952, an estimated 130,000 Lithuanians were deported to labor camps in Siberia, 70% of them women and children. Greta watched as neighbors disappeared in the night, their homes looted, their names erased from village records. She understood that she was living on borrowed time, that her survival depended on maintaining the lie. She stopped thinking of herself as Greta. She stopped dreaming of Königsberg. She became Grażyna, not by choice but by necessity. Years passed. Greta, Grażyna, grew into a young woman. She married a Lithuanian man, a quiet farmer, who asked few questions about her past. She bore children and raised them as Lithuanians, teaching them nothing of her origins. She never spoke German again, not even in private. The language felt dangerous, like a relic of a life that had been stolen from her. She attended church, observed Lithuanian holidays, and moved through the rhythms of rural life with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to disappear. But inside, a part of her remained frozen, a little girl standing in the doorway of a farmhouse, waiting for her mother to return. In 1990, the Soviet Union collapsed. Lithuania declared independence, and the silence that had suffocated the wolf children for decades began to lift. Slowly, cautiously, some of the survivors began to speak. They shared their stories with historians, journalists, and each other. They formed small support groups, gathering in community halls to remember the names they had been forced to forget. Grażyna attended one such meeting in the spring of 1991. She sat in the back, her hands folded in her lap, listening as others recounted their journeys, the hunger, the fear, the loss of identity. When it was her turn to speak, she stood and said quietly, "My name was Greta." It was the first time she had spoken her real name aloud in 47 years. The room fell silent. Then someone began to cry, and others joined in, and Greta, Grażyna, felt something break open inside her, something she had kept locked away for a lifetime. The rediscovery of the wolf children's stories came slowly, painstakingly, through the work of dedicated historians like Ruth Lizarowicz and Lithuanian authors like Alvydas Šlepikas. Archives were opened, documents were uncovered, and survivors were finally able to speak without fear of punishment. Some wolf children managed to reunite with long-lost siblings or distant relatives. Others discovered that their entire families had perished, lost in the chaos of war, the bombings, the death marches. Many never found answers. The records were incomplete, the trail too cold, the years too long. Greta never learned what happened to her mother or her brother. She searched through Red Cross records, through lists of displaced persons, through the archives of the International Tracing Service, but found nothing. They had vanished like so many millions into the void of war. In the final years of her life, Grażyna, who had once been Greta, lived in a small apartment in Vilnius. She kept a photograph on her nightstand, a faded image of a little girl in a pale blue dress, holding a porcelain doll. She did not remember when the photograph was taken or who had taken it, but she knew it was her. She knew it was Greta. She would stare at that photograph for hours, tracing the outline of the child's face, searching for some trace of recognition, some connection to the person she had been. But the child in the photograph felt like a stranger. someone she had known once long ago in another life. She died in 2003 at the age of 67. Her children buried her under the name Grażyna because that was the only name they had ever known, but on her gravestone they added a small inscription, at her request, Ehemals Greta, once Greta. The story of the wolf children is not one of glory or heroism in the traditional sense. It is a story of survival, of the brutal choices forced upon the most vulnerable, of the erasure of identity as a condition of existence. These children were not soldiers. They carried no weapons. They held no power. They were simply children caught in the machinery of war, discarded by one regime and hidden by another. Their acts of courage were quiet, invisible, learning a new language, swallowing their fear, forgetting their names. And the courage of the Lithuanian families who sheltered them was equally profound. They risked everything, their freedom, their lives, their families, to protect children they did not know, children who represented the enemy. They forged documents, lied to authorities, and carried the weight of that lie for decades. What Greta's story reveals is the profound moral complexity of war. The Lithuanians who sheltered wolf children were themselves victims of Soviet terror, having endured mass deportations, executions, and the suppression of their own national identity. Yet they extended compassion to German children, despite the fact that German forces had occupied Lithuania from 1941 to 1944, bringing with them the machinery of the Holocaust and the annihilation of Lithuania's Jewish population. Over 90% of Lithuanian Jews were murdered during the German occupation, more than 190,000 people, many with the active participation of Lithuanian collaborators. The trauma of that genocide was still raw when the wolf children arrived, and yet for some Lithuanians, the sight of a starving child transcended the logic of revenge. This is not to romanticize or simplify the history. Many Lithuanians did turn the wolf children away. Some set dogs on them, beat them, or handed them over to Soviet authorities. Survival was a luxury few could afford, and compassion was a risk many could not take. But those who did shelter the children made a choice to see a human being rather than an enemy, to prioritize life over ideology. It is a choice that continues to resonate decades later, in a world still riven by conflict, displacement, and the dehumanization of the other. Greta's story, like those of thousands of other wolf children, was buried for half a century beneath layers of silence, fear, and shame. It was buried because speaking the truth was dangerous, because memory itself was a liability, because survival required forgetting. But in the end, the truth could not be buried forever. The children who became adults, who lived full lives under borrowed names, eventually found the courage to reclaim their pasts. They spoke their real names aloud. They remembered, and in doing so, they ensured that the world would remember too. Not the grand narratives of battles and generals, but the small, shattering stories of ordinary people forced to make impossible choices. A little girl who lost her name, a grandmother who risked her life to save a stranger's child, a silence that lasted 47 years. These are the stories that matter. These are the stories that shape us. Greta's life was defined by loss, the loss of her family, her home, her language, her identity, but it was also defined by survival, by the stubborn, quiet persistence of memory, by the refusal to be entirely erased. She lived in the shadow of war for her entire life, carrying a past she could not speak and a future built on a lie. Yet she lived, she loved, she raised children who never knew her real name but who carried unknowingly the legacy of her courage. And when the silence finally broke, when the world finally began to listen, she stood and said, "My name was Greta." That act of speaking, of reclaiming the name that had been stolen from her, was an act of profound defiance, a declaration that the past, no matter how painful, no matter how buried, could not be erased. Today, the story of the wolf children is taught in Lithuanian schools and memorialized in documentaries, books, and exhibitions. The Lithuanian government eventually provided small pensions to the surviving wolf children, acknowledging their suffering and their resilience. Germany, too, has begun to reckon with this forgotten chapter of history, though recognition came too late for most of the survivors. The last of the wolf children are now in their 80s and 90s, their memories fading, their voices growing quiet, but their stories remain, etched into the archives, spoken in interviews, passed down through generations. They remind us that history is not only written by the powerful, but also by the powerless, that the smallest acts of kindness can echo across decades, that forgetting is not the same as erasure, and that even a name, whispered in the dark, can be an act of resistance. Greta's story ends not with triumph or redemption, but with a quiet, aching truth. She survived, but at the cost of herself. She lived a long life, but it was a life built on the ruins of another. She was loved but never entirely known, and in the end she died carrying two names, two identities, two lives, one stolen, one forged, neither entirely her own. Her story is a reminder that war does not end when the guns fall silent, that its wounds are carried forward by those who survive, that the scars of displacement and erasure can last a lifetime. It is a story of a little girl who stood in a doorway and watched her world burn, who learned to speak a new language and forget her own, who became someone else in order to live. And it is a story that asks us, in a world still scarred by conflict and cruelty, to remember the forgotten, to speak the names of the erased, and to recognize that the most profound acts of courage are often the quietest.